So, life under the sun, and this morning the search for satisfaction. Last week, I suspect most of you were here, but if you weren't, we looked at the first 11 verses of Ecclesiastes, which is a bit like an overture. If you've ever been to a concert or a musical, often you'll hear an overture, which is a kind of introduction to the whole work. And in chapter 1, the first 11 verses, we were introduced to the themes of vanity. Remember, vanity is breath, vapour. Something that disappears almost immediately. As soon as it appears, it disappears. Toil under the sun, hard work, sweat. And then all, it seems in verse 3 of chapter 1, for no gain. What does man gain for all his labour, at which he toils under the sun? These are some of the themes that we're going to have repeated over the course of Ecclesiastes. But this week, in chapter 1 from verse 12 onwards, the investigation that the teacher, Solomon, the king in Jerusalem, the investigation that he's conducting goes into real depth. He begins to pursue some of these possibilities. Where am I going to find meaning? Where is satisfaction? So, in chapter 1 verse 12, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. We're reminded, aren't we, of the vantage point of the teacher. He is king in Jerusalem. He is a man with great power, great authority. He had wealth. And now he's saying, with all this power, all these means that I have, I'm going to conduct a serious endeavour to explore all that is done under heaven. The phrase under heaven is pretty much the same as under the sun. It's just a variation of that same idea. And the tool he's going to use, he says, is wisdom. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom. Remember that, by wisdom. All that is done under heaven. But we're told almost immediately that the task is hopeless. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. The first reference to God in this book. What a heavy, and it says almost a judgment. What a heavy judgment God has put over us. Because he says, as I began to pursue this investigation, to explore by wisdom all that is done under the sun, I realised what a heavy burden, how impossible the task is. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. They're all meaningless, he says. A chasing after the wind. One person writing about this said it's like chasing after the wind, it's like herding cats. If you ever tried to do that, herd cats, you can't do it. You can chase your tail if you're a dog. You're never going to catch it. And indeed, not only that, but all it brings, it seems, is at the end of this section, verse 18, with much sorrow, much wisdom comes much sorrow, and the more knowledge, the more grief. What a heavy burden. A chasing after the wind. What is twisted, verse 15, what is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. Imagine you're trying to fix something and you go to your toolbox and you've got there a screw and it's rusted and bent. And it's completely useless for the purpose, isn't it? It is twisted, it cannot be straightened again. It's only good for throwing away. Or maybe you love doing jigsaws and you've got this 1,000-piece jigsaw and you spend hours and hours putting it together. And then you find that the last piece is missing. It's been lost. And the jigsaw will remain incomplete forever. What is lacking cannot be counted. It's not there. It cannot be done. It's an impossible task. And yet in verse 16, he seems to redouble his efforts. I thought to myself, look, think about it. I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. Remember last week we looked at Solomon and how he'd asked for the gift of wisdom and been given it, and how he was wiser than anyone in the whole of that region. And people came from the end, Queen Sheba came from the ends of the earth to hear his wisdom. And he'd think, look, I've been given all this wisdom, surely I should be able to work this out. And this time he includes something called madness and folly. Look, I've been growing and increased in wisdom more than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom, but also, he says, of madness and folly. He's not going to leave any stone unturned. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. And yet, what it brings is not gain, but actually sorrow and grief, he says in verse 18. I think there are two things we learn right at the start of this task. First of all, wisdom. Do you remember wisdom in the Bible? Where does it go back to? Go back to Genesis chapter 3. What happened there? When the woman sought the fruit because she saw it was good for making her wise, she sought wisdom. What did it bring her? Grief, wasn't it, in the fall. True wisdom in the Bible actually doesn't begin with us, does it? That's where this teacher has begun, himself. But actually, if we think about wisdom and the whole pursuit of wisdom, it doesn't begin with us. The Bible is very clear, time and again in Proverbs, in Psalms, in Job, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, isn't it? But you see, that isn't where this man started, is it? He started with the gift that he's been given. And he thinks it's his to own and possess. He says, I have seen all the things. What is it? He says, I've grown. I have grown and increased in wisdom. He's like Eve, isn't he? In that sense that he now desires the gift rather than the giver. And the second thing is I think the purpose of this passage is to point us back to that episode in Genesis. Not just the fact that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but to remind us of the curse. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. That goes back, doesn't it, to the curse that follows when Adam and Eve decided to go their own way and disobey the commands. In fact, it has been said this whole book of Ecclesiastes is an exposition of the fall, Genesis chapter 3. It tells us, I think, that sin is far more pervasive than we realised. So often we think of sin as being a particular category, as something that we do on one occasion, and we can rub it out again afterwards. But it's not. It pervades the whole of life, the whole of our existence, our desires, our search for satisfaction is plagued by sin. Do you realise how pervasive sin is? Not only in your life, but in the world around you. And if you pursue anything with any intent without looking for God first, you're going to fail. It's a hopeless task. Nevertheless, Solomon decides that that's all he can do. And so he goes ahead with this investigation into pleasure in chapter 2 and the first 11 verses. He's like a scientist, isn't he, in this sense? You remember last week we looked at 1 Kings where Solomon is, isn't that, a sort of scientist, isn't he? And he plants those fruit trees in 1 Kings 4, remember that, and he examines things, he categorises them. He's got a brilliant brain. And here he's using it to follow what we call, I think today, the empirical approach of science. That is, he carries out experiments and he observes to see what the results are, and he measures them. That is the scientific approach. And he's saying, here is the problem. What will bring satisfaction to my heart? I'm going to experiment to see what will work best. And so, in verses 2 and 3, we have party time. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind still guiding me with wisdom. So as he's saying, he didn't completely throw himself into folly, but he was using it with his mind as an experiment. I want to try folly and see what happens. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. So he enjoys life. He has a good time. He indulges fun and laughter. I guess these sorts of things here, isn't it? But on a bigger scale than just bubbles and Easter eggs. But the morning after, the night before, he asks the same question, doesn't he? Look at back chapter 1 and verse 3. What does man gain for all his labour at which he toils under the sun? And so he says here in verse 2, and what does pleasure accomplish? What actually is the net result of it? What does it achieve? Not a lot, perhaps a headache the next morning, and some sort of temporary respite from that heavy burden that is placed on us. Many people have followed Solomon's path here and discovered what we call the paradox of pleasure, the paradox of hedonism. The more you seek pleasure, the more you try and get pleasure, the less it satisfies you. Have you ever tried that? That's the experiment that people have tried, isn't it? But the more you seek pleasure, the more you go after trying to indulge yourself and find satisfaction in sensual desires, the less it will satisfy you. That's what the last few generations in this country and elsewhere in the West have discovered with drugs and sex and alcohol. They're anaesthetics. They may dull the senses for a short time, but you wake up in the morning and you think like Ecclesiastes, what have I gained from all this? So he turns his mind to more serious projects and pursuits. Verse 4. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. Here is a man who's wanted to make his mark on the world. I won't just spend my money on pleasure. I will do things that will have some sort of lasting significance, he says. I want to be an engineer and build things that will achieve something. And people will look back and say, wow, look at that. Or I'll be an horticulturalist and grow things that will bring delight to people. I suppose today you look at things like Brunel, a great engineer from the last century, whose railways still, of course, run across here, down the estuary, here, and the great bridges he built and the tunnels. Or the Eden projects, down there in Cornwall by St Austell. There, that idea of building a little replica of the Garden of Eden that you can go and enjoy. And yet, what gain is there for the individual who goes about this? We'll see in a minute. But he carries on, and verses 7 and 8, and he decides he's going to achieve personal greatness and fame. So verse 7, I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. Slaves, of course, were a measure of wealth. Today we might say how many acres we own, or how many acres we have in our house perhaps, if we have got large houses. Or maybe how much money in our bank accounts. Or if you're an American, how many planes you have at your disposal, that sort of thing. But here it's slaves, they're a measure of wealth. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed gold and silver and gold for myself from the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women, singers, and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. Remember back, we read last week about Solomon having a harem of 700 wives and 300 concubines. He didn't just accumulate wealth in these forms, but we see in verse 10, he gave himself fully to enjoying the exercise of pleasure. You know, some people like to acquire wealth, and they can be very miserly. Do you remember Scrooge in A Christmas Carol? He was a very wealthy man, wasn't he? But he never enjoyed what he had accumulated. But Solomon, unlike that, is not going to deny himself. Verse 10, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labour. Yet, and here's the conclusion to this experiment with pleasure, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. That is the net result of this experiment with pleasure. And so he continues. And in verse 12 of chapter 2, he looks again at wisdom, but I think this time it's with a slightly different angle. He wants to compare wisdom and folly and think about whether actually he might just give up wisdom and indulge himself fully in folly. Then I considered my thoughts, to consider wisdom, and also madness and folly. Does it matter whether we are wise or foolish? If wisdom leads nowhere apart from grief and sorrow, why not just forget it, and just go into the area of folly? One acts, in other words, irrationally. Indeed, in the 20th century, I mentioned last week, the 19th century had been a century of great progress, a century of idealism. But in the 20th century, we've seen the death of idealism. And people now struggle to find any ideals, don't they, to live for. What are we progressing towards? Terrorism, climate obliteration. And so people turn, don't they, to folly. They turn to madness. They turn perhaps to drugs. The suicide rate is higher than ever, I think, in this country. Because people are turning to folly. They can't see any benefit from using rationality. There is no progress to be made. You get people now who commit acts of terrorism that almost seem like self-contradictory, destructive acts. Why not act like that, says Solomon? If wisdom doesn't produce anything, let's give ourselves over to ridiculous folly, to acting madly. And yet in verse 13, he says, despite that, I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. You may have heard the phrase before, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Is that familiar to you at all? Better to have loved and lost. I think you say the same thing, can't you, about wisdom? It's better to have been wise and have seen no gain from it than never to have been wise at all. Somehow we know that it's part of our inner nature that we are made as rational creatures. We need to use wisdom. It may not necessarily produce the gain, but we know that actually to throw ourselves into folly is also no answer either. Socrates, that great Greek philosopher, said famously that the unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, use wisdom to think about why we are alive, what we're doing here. Rational thought is essential to our humanity, isn't it? God has given us brains, let's use them. It's the very heart, what we would say, is a civilized society that we see around us. Civilized society seems to be breaking down more and more, doesn't it, into, and we often say what a mad world it is, because people are throwing themselves into madness because they cannot see the gain from it. But we need to recognise God has given us brains. He's given us rationality. Don't throw it over. But it doesn't answer our deepest needs. Verse 14, second part of verse 14. It may well, verse 14 itself, verse 14, first part. The wise man has eyes in his head while the fool walks in the darkness, he says. But I came to realise that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said in my heart, this too is meaningless, for the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. So wisdom, why it is somehow something we must cherish and preserve, it will not answer by itself our deepest needs. It's not the wisdom that Solomon is pursuing, at any rate. The wise and the foolish both end up in the same place. And later on in Ecclesiastes, the writer will come to examine that fate, that end of the human person in death, and make up or draw his own conclusions about that. But for now, he comes to two conclusions in this last section from verse 17. Two conclusions. First of all, verses 17 to 23. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things that I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the work into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. Some of you may know that Solomon's son who succeeded him was a guy called Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was a foolish man. In the first few years of his reign, the king of Egypt came up and devastated Judah and took the temple and took away all the gold shields that Solomon had made for him. And some of his wealth began to disappear. So what Solomon had feared did come true. He was followed by a fool, and all that wealth that he accumulated began to dissipate. Verse 20, so my heart began to despair, and that's the first conclusion we have here. Despair. over all my toilsome labour under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with which he labours under the sun? Verse 23, all his days, his work is pain and grief. Even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. You can add anxiety, can't you, and insomnia to sorrow and grief as the rewards of wisdom. The more we investigate it, all we find is pain, anxiety, meaninglessness. And so Solomon, the teacher here, despairs of life. He hates life. He's not suicidal, but he despairs of there being anything that is worth living for. And so we come to a second conclusion, which is rather strange. And many people have wondered about these last 3 verses, because he seems suddenly to find satisfaction. Let's read them again. Verse 24. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth, to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. At first sight, you read those and think, well, that's contradictory, isn't it? He just said that life is meaningless, and all he can find, or all he can do, is despair of it. But now he seems to find satisfaction. But notice one thing. In that short paragraph, God appears by name 3 times, and the pronoun for God, he or him, another 3 times. 6 times in those 3 verses, God is mentioned. Up till now, he's been mentioned once in the whole book, and that with reference to judgments, the heavy burden that he's put on men. Suddenly, God is now mentioned in a more positive light. You see, the man's perspective has changed, and suddenly you find that when your perspective changes, everything can change with it. Contentment and satisfaction is possible in our work and our pleasures, but only when they are received from the hand of God. That's what he says, isn't it? This too, I see, is from the hand of God. It's not something he has in himself, it's received as a gift. For the sinner, that refers to the unbeliever, the fool who ignores God. He may well have God on his lips, but like that rich fool we saw earlier in that little cartoon film, he has no time for him in practice. And that sinner, the unbeliever, the fool, treats this world as an end in itself. Seeks pleasure for its own sake, like that fool did. And it all becomes meaningless. Vanity, mere breath. So satisfaction is possible. But first of all, we have to give attention to the giver, the one from whose hand we receive these things. And then it can have meaning. This will be developed more during the course of Ecclesiastes, but I think there are some important applications that I want us to spend some time thinking about before we finish this morning. This is a really important area for us who live in the West. By the Western world, the world that is obsessed with money and with wealth and with consumerism. That is us, the world we live in. We are swamped by these things, and we need to take careful note of this passage this morning and think about how we respond to materialism and pleasure. The Greeks had a philosophy called Epicureanism, and in many ways our society, Western society, can trace its roots back to Greece. Greek philosophy is very powerful even today in our thinking. Epicureanism says this very briefly: pleasure is the beginning and end of living happily. Pleasure is the beginning and end of living happily. I wonder if any of you have actually absorbed that without thinking about it, and though you may be here on a Sunday morning, actually between now and next week, most of your life will be governed by that philosophy more than what you learn today. I hope that's not the case, but I think it is, unfortunately, very often the case in many churches around this country, indeed in the Western world. I think many of you also will know of the comedian Peter Cook. Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, remember that comedy dual act a few years ago? Peter Cook said this: "Life is a matter of passing the time enjoyably. There may be other things in life, but I've been too busy passing my time enjoyably to think very deeply about them." Isn't that tragic? There is someone who is an intelligent man, a comedian who entertained and gave pleasure to millions. And all he was concerned about in his whole life until he died was how to live pleasurably. He was an Epicurean through and through. And I think that philosophy is very powerful today. And even if you don't think yourself today as being Epicurean, that philosophy will be something that will be impinging itself on you from the world you live in. When you turn on the television or you listen to the radio, whatever you do, the books you read, the magazines, it will all the time be trying to press you into that mould. Live life to the fullest. Watch the adverts, just not too long. But watch them on TV and they're saying, you can have it all. Indulge yourself. So what are you going to do about this? I've got 3 suggestions. First of all, we need to understand that there is nothing wrong with pleasure in itself. Nothing wrong with pleasure in itself. In the Garden of Eden, God gave man and woman, Adam and Eve, much that they could actually enjoy. Those fruit trees that were in the Garden of Eden, it said they were trees that were pleasing to the eye and were good for food. If they only thought about those trees, not the tree at the centre, that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they would have had a great time in paradise. Psalm 16, David says that one day you will fill me with eternal pleasures. And it says, at your right hand. Because God has pleasures to give us. He wants us to enjoy life. The kingdom of heaven, when Jesus tells parables about the kingdom of heaven, the most common picture is of a great banquet where you can sit and enjoy yourself with all that food before you, and wine as well. God is the author of pleasure. What spoils pleasure is our determination to make them, the pleasures, give us ultimate satisfaction. And they can't deliver, can they? But people expect them to. What about you? Do you expect pleasure to be something which you can actually obtain from the thing itself, and actually you don't acknowledge the giver? How are you going to guard against that? How are you going to train your mind against that temptation, against that danger? Secondly, Tim can hear you, so if you can be a bit quiet, we appreciate that. Secondly, a godly perspective makes all the difference. A godly perspective makes all the difference. That's what happens in these last 3 verses here of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Paul says to Timothy, everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, because it is then consecrated by the word of God and prayer. And he says to the Corinthians, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Will you put the giver first on every occasion? Can I ask you, do you say grace before you have a meal? And if you say grace before a meal, why do you do that? What is going through your mind? When we were kids, we were in our family, we were, I suppose, brought up in I'll say a nominal Christian family. It was a fraction more than that, but not much more than that. And we were taught from very young to say grace at the end of the meal. We couldn't get down from the table until we said, thank you, God, for my good tea. Please, can I get down? And the only thought in our mind was, I want to go off and play or watch TV. Okay, so we repeated it, rote fashion. But now I say grace before meals, because I want to recognise the giver. Do you do that as well? And when you do it, do you think about this and think, actually, this is good food, but I want to recognise, before I eat a bit of it, I want to recognise the giver. Because the perspective changes our whole understanding and our whole satisfaction. A meal is a whole lot more satisfying when you've recognised the giver first. This is a good gift from heaven. Thank you, Father. When Jesus fed the 5,000, what did he do first? He gave a prayer of thanksgiving, didn't he? And then broke the bread. because he recognised the giver. The people who ate it just wanted to fill their bellies. But he first of all recognised the good God who had given him this ability to make this food for these thousands to eat. Thirdly and lastly, I want you to examine your desires. Millions of lottery players would have been very satisfied if they'd been in Solomon's shoes. They wouldn't want to play the lottery, they'd have it all, wouldn't they? But actually, when they play the lottery, that's what they want. They want to be like Solomon. They want to have all this wealth at their disposal, to be able to buy the things of their dreams, the holidays of their dreams, the boat of their dreams, the home of their dreams, to travel wherever according to their dreams. Just like that rich fool. What a silly dream to have, isn't it? I remember there's a lady I once met who I've asked to come to services here and hasn't in fact come once or twice here, but not for many years now. But on a Sunday morning once, I went to get some bread for communion for a Sunday. And I met her outside. She was around the corner of the supermarket, and she had a scratch card there. And she was desperate to find out whether she'd won anything on the scratch card. She wouldn't be here, but she'll be on a Sunday morning looking for that wealth, looking for that pleasure that will come from winning money from a scratch card. And yet Jesus says, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world but forfeit their soul? Or what can you give in exchange for your soul? To Solomon's great credit here, he wasn't satisfied. Many millions would be, wouldn't they? Perhaps even you would be. I don't know. Think about it. If you had all Solomon's power and wealth, would you say, oh, I'll give my right arm for all that? But he wasn't satisfied. He kept asking ultimate questions. C.S. Lewis, who I think is one of the great prophets of our age, he's dead now, I know, but his work speaks so powerfully to us. He said this about pleasure. If we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum, because he cannot imagine what it's meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased, he says. Can I ask you, are you too easily pleased? Do you aim at the lesser things, the Easter eggs and the bubbles, whatever it may be in your case? Perhaps it isn't those two things. I'm sure it's not. But what are you aiming for? What satisfies you? What are your goals? Is God there? Do you hunger and thirst for him, like that psalmist did at the very beginning? As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You'll have heard of William Wilberforce, won't you? The man who led that campaign against the slave trade. He was a Christian, but he wasn't always a Christian. As a young man, he was powerful, he was from a good family, he had wealth, he had lands, he had influence. He was a good friend of William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister, who wanted to promote him in the cabinet, and indeed some people spoke of him as a future Prime Minister himself. He says this in his autobiography. Often, while in the full enjoyment of all that this world could bestow, my conscience told me that in the true sense of the word, I was not a Christian. He was coming under what we call conviction of sin. He knew that his desire for all these pleasures meant that he didn't really desire God at all, even though he was a churchgoer. I laughed. I sang. I was apparently gay and happy. But the thoughts would steal across me. What madness is all this? To continue easy in a state in which a sudden call out of this world would consign me to everlasting misery. And that, when eternal happiness is within my grasp. And he did grasp it. Eternal happiness. He became a believer. And he recognised that all those good things that were offered to him were to be eschewed in favour of God first and foremost. And yes, God did give him a position in Parliament, and he had many other good things as well in his life, but he didn't treat them as pleasures to be enjoyed for their own sake. He treated them as God's good gifts to him. Think about that testimony. Think about how he was convicted that his heart wasn't right because he knew that he didn't desire God first. And ask yourself that question. Is God first in your heart? Jesus says you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Do you come short on that? Like William Wilberforce, do you need to recognise that actually, truly, you're not a Christian? Because that desire is not in your heart. You desire other things that your money gets spent on during the week. Are you far too easily pleased? And like Solomon, you need to start searching for something that is better than all of these meaningless things around us. Don't be duped by the world. I don't know if you're there yet or not, whether you've reached that point of knowing that actually eternal riches are at your right hand, that you can enjoy all that God wants to give you. But don't give up the search, like Solomon. Don't be satisfied with less. Don't be too easily pleased. Don't be duped. Be blessed. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, says Jesus. For they will be filled. You will find satisfaction in him, in a way that nothing in this world can give you. Do you believe that? And if you do, will you seek it with all your heart? Come, all you who are thirsty. Come to the waters. And you who have no money, come. Buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labour on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, and eat what is good, and your soul will delight in the richest of fare. Let's just bow our heads, meditate on those words before we sing a song that is based on those words.